Hello, I'm Paul Johnson. I'm director of the Institute for Fiscal Studies, and along with many other economists over the last little while, we've been thinking about talking about the cost of living crisis. So what is it? Well, immediately, of course, it is just a reduction in all of our incomes. We are going to be worse off in this year, 2022, and next year, 2023, than we were before. And that's a pretty unusual thing to happen, actually. You only see that usually once every decade or two when we're in deep recession. This time is unusual in many respects. The first is just the scale of that fall in our incomes. The Office of Budget Responsibility, that's the government's fiscal watchdog, in the 2022 autumn statement suggested that incomes might fall by 7% over those 2 years. That would be much the biggest fall in our standard of living over a 2-year period at any time since these statistics were first collected, and that's back since the late 1940s. So that really is an extraordinary fact, a 7% fall, if that's what happens in our standard of living. What's driving that? Well, of course, largely it is international factors, the huge increase in the prices of energy and to some extent food, what economists call the terms of trade shock. We've all just got worse off because the stuff that we import, things like energy and food, has got a great deal more expensive in relative to the things that we ourselves produce. Just to give you some sense of the scale, in most years up till last year, the UK economy, about 2%, a bit less than 2% of it was used up in paying for energy. This year and next, it may well be 8% or even more. So a fourfold increase in the amount of our resources that has to go into buying energy. There is some good news here, which is that this is going to be a broadly based cost of living crisis. In other words, not like the recession that I remember first from the early 1980s, when we had huge increases in unemployment and actually people in work were doing really very well. So that was a decade of an enormous increase in inequality. The good news, if you can think of it as good news, is that it looks like this crisis will be all of us getting a bit worse off rather than a minority becoming very much worse off and some people getting along fine. Now, that will have political as well as economic consequences. The other really key point to understand here is that this fall in living standards comes not after a normal period where, and maybe we should stop thinking it as normal, but if those of us who remember the period before 2008, for decades, on average, incomes would rise 1 or 2% a year, or 2.5% a year, year on year on year. So we went into the last big crisis, well, pre-COVID anyway, in 2008, after 20 or even 30 years of gradually increasing incomes and earnings. So whilst there was a big recession then, actually people were worse off relative to where they were 3 or 4 years ago, but certainly not relative to longer ago than that. What's been really unusual about the period since 2010 is that incomes have barely risen at all. In terms of earnings, we've had probably the worst 10 or 15 years for earnings growth of any period, probably since the beginning of the Industrial Revolution. Earnings have barely risen at all over this period. Incomes have done a bit better, partly because pensioners and some sorts of other incomes have done a bit better than earnings. So we're going into this cost of living crisis off the back of a very difficult period for households in any case. So as it were, there's not much fat to fall back on. So we're seeing a big fall in our incomes, and we're seeing it off the back of a period of fairly poor income growth. How's that going to affect people across the distribution? As I said, it will be fairly broadly based. The government actually is doing quite a lot to support those on the lowest incomes through their energy price support, through making sure that no one's bills, in the short run at least, don't rise above £2,500. In the longer run, don't rise above £3,000. But remember, energy bills pre-crisis were on average about half that, less than £1,500 per year. So still a big hit for people on low incomes. And the benefit system by itself isn't doing enough to keep up the slack, partly because benefits rise in line with inflation where it was the previous September. And that means benefit levels are still lagging where they were 2 or 3 years ago. Among people in work, the minimum wage, the national living wage, has risen quite fast over the last several years, and indeed it's risen much faster than average wages. So people on minimum wages are, in some sense, being relatively well protected. What I think we're going to see is that really people on middling sorts of earnings, so £30,000, which is about average earnings, and somewhat above that, people are going to really be feeling a pinch in a way that often in previous recessions, previous crises, they haven't. Now, on top of that, of course, we've got a rising tax burden. So taxes are rising because the point at which you start to pay income tax is not going up in line with inflation. That's dragging more and more people into the income tax net. A key question about what happens next, of course, is going to be how long these prices stay high, how long inflation stays high. Earnings themselves are rising only at maybe 6% when inflation is at 10%. That's a big real terms cut. The OBR expects inflation to be 5 or 6% next year. I suspect that earnings won't keep up with that. And if you look at the Bank of England forecast, they're expecting a long period where we don't really recover to the incomes that we're on at the moment. Now, I've talked a little bit about those on the very lowest incomes, somewhat protected, but certainly not entirely protected. And don't forget, of course, they spend more of their income on things like energy and food than the people who are better off. I've talked about people who are in work, who've suffered a long period of squeeze on their earnings. There's also, of course, pensioners. They're seeing their benefits rise in line with prices, though, again, they tend to spend rather more of their income on things like energy, and so will be more affected by that. Now, there'll be some pensioners whose other incomes, because they're getting inflation-protected occupational pensions, will also rise in line with prices, but there'll be others who are on fixed incomes, who've got savings and are reliant on those, who will begin to feel the squeeze. But for them, this comes off the back of a long period of continually increasing incomes and assets. And one of the things that I guess worries me about the long-term trajectory of inequality in the UK is that people of working age, particularly younger people of working age, have really done particularly badly and fallen behind those who had wealth and occupational pensions and housing and so on, particularly after or before the financial crisis hit in 2008. So there's a lot of things going on. There's a lot of reasons why this particular cost of living crisis is having, I think, the impact that we're seeing. It's very broad-based. It's affecting everyone. It's coming off the back of a very difficult time, and particularly a difficult time for younger people of working age. There are lots of other concerns I could talk about, but I'll just mention a couple. One is a big increase in numbers of people who are out of work on sickness benefits of one kind or another. Again, an extraordinary thing that came out of the Office of Budget Responsibility forecasts in November was a suggestion there'll be very big increases or further increases in numbers of people dependent on disability benefits. That might be to do with mental health, that might be to do with long COVID, that might be to do with other physical problems. We seem to be getting sicker as a nation, and that's a real long-term problem. And we are seeing separately, in addition to that, quite a large number of older people leaving the labour market altogether. Now, a lot of that appears to be voluntary. They may have to return because of what's happening as a result of the cost of living, crisis. So it's a very multifaceted set of issues that we're facing at the moment after a long period, which is very different from the many decades that preceded it. And looking forward, I'm afraid, at least as far as the main forecasters are concerned, we're not going to be growing very fast in terms of the economy or earnings over the next few years. That is, of course, all uncertain. If gas prices continue to fall significantly and the economy recovers and the global economy recovers, things might look rather better than it looks at the moment. I will, I think, stop there. It's always very dangerous to speculate about the future. It's quite hard enough to understand what's going on at the moment. But at the moment, as I say, we are in a very difficult couple of years.